I call the Honourable Member Grant Robertson.
Thank you, Mr. Speaker. Isn't it interesting that the Minister began her speech by telling us that the welfare system is failing New Zealanders? Well, I would suggest to the Minister that what's failing New Zealanders is a government that hasn't even got an economic plan to grow jobs in this country. That's what's failing New Zealanders. And the culture of blame that underlies everything that the Minister is doing in this area means that the government is failing to take responsibility for actually creating the jobs, for actually being part of growing the economy. Instead, it's much, much easier for this Minister and this government to find small groups of people in society to blame. And that is the best this government can do when it comes to a welfare policy, is to find people to blame. Ms Bennett says she wants to make welfare less attractive. I'll tell you what will make welfare less attractive: jobs. That's what will make welfare less attractive, is that people actually have jobs that they can go into. The whole premise of this piece of legislation is to find people to blame, to couch it in a culture of dependency, rather than couching it in a culture of a government prepared to invest in New Zealanders and invest in their future, Mr. Speaker. Mr. Speaker, New Zealanders want to work. There will always be one or two people in our society who will shirk their responsibilities, and that is wrong, and that is unacceptable, and the Ministry of Social Development needs to work with those people to make sure they do not shirk their responsibilities. But let's not kid ourselves that that's the majority of people. Let's not kid ourselves that New Zealanders don't want to work. People want to work. The job opportunities are simply not there. And it gets harder and harder every day. When university graduates, Mr. Speaker, are taking between 6 months and a year to get a job, no wonder it's hard for people who've been on benefits who haven't got qualifications to get a job. But this piece of legislation just says blame. It doesn't say invest. It doesn't say support, it doesn't say train, it doesn't say create work opportunities, it says blame. And that, Mr. Speaker, is simply not good enough. Because the biggest problem we have in New Zealand is that we are not creating enough jobs for our young people, and we are not creating enough training opportunities for people to develop their skills. Mr. Speaker, one consequence of this bill is effectively the end of youth transition services. Now, youth transition services have been extremely successful in supporting young New Zealanders who are struggling to find work into work opportunities. Many members of this House will have visited youth transition service offices. There is a very successful one in Gisborne. They helped 500 people last year. Under this bill, Mr. Speaker, only 38 of those people will qualify for assistance. 500 people assisted under the Youth Transition Service. Ms Bennett comes along with her proposal and only 38 of those 500 people will still be supported. Mr. Speaker, this bill is letting down young New Zealanders. It is not supporting young New Zealanders into work, and work should be the first focus. The availability of work should be the first focus, not a political dog whistle, not an exercise in blame towards young New Zealanders. Mr. Speaker, it's interesting that in the justification for this legislation, we hear that the government believes that there will be savings in the order of $1 billion over 4 years. Savings of $1 billion. Well, it came out in the select committee process that that's in fact a guess. Now, the government's quite fond of guessing when it comes to its economic proposals. We had that with the sale of state assets, where Bill English decided to guess. But that's simply a guess. But, Mr. Speaker, there's an extraordinary statement in the regulatory impact statement on this bill. Once upon a time, regulatory impact statements were attached to legislation. In this legislation, after the government suggests that there will be savings of around $1 billion, it goes on to say that the Treasury and the Ministry of Social Development have isolated the impact of the policy changes that are in this particular piece of legislation. And as it goes on to describe, Mr. Speaker, what the impact of the changes in this legislation will be, there's a sentence withheld. I think that is possibly the first time I have ever seen a regulatory impact statement, the statement provided to this House to allow us to debate a piece of legislation properly, and there's a sentence withheld in it. That is extraordinary. It means that the Minister and the government don't want us to know what the actual projections of impacts of this bill are. Mr. Speaker, I regard that as a major issue for this House. The fact that the regulatory impact statement, which we as opposition members rely upon to tell us about the impact of the government's legislative program, has a sentence withheld in it about how much money they think they're going to save. And no wonder the officials at the Select Committee didn't want to talk about it, didn't want to confirm what the so-called savings would be, because now they're withholding the information. And Mr Speaker, I think that's unacceptable. It means that we go into debating this legislation unaware of what the government actually thinks the impacts of these changes will be, and I don't think they should be proceeding with them with that kind of situation taking place. Mr Speaker, when we look at the issue of the changes around those on the domestic purposes benefit, we need to be absolutely clear about whether the government is focusing on the correct problem here. Between January 2009 and January 2012, the number of people on the DPB rose by 13%. But between January 2009 and January 2012, the number of people on the unemployment benefit rose by 82%. So are we really addressing the biggest problem, Mr Speaker, in terms of people who are relying on welfare today by doing what the government's doing? If we were focusing on jobs, if we were focusing on legislation that was providing training opportunities for people who are on benefits, then perhaps we would be addressing that 82% increase in the number of people on the unemployment benefit. But instead, what we have from the Minister is more of the culture of blame, the culture of a so-called long-term welfare dependency, when many of those people would just like to find a job, Mr Speaker, would just like to find a job. The other element that always confuses me about these kinds of proposals, particularly the changes around the age at which someone's children are when they are asked to go out and work, is what are the costs involved in finding some of these mythical jobs that happily exist in the middle of the day between 9 and 3. How much do we actually know about how many of those sorts of jobs out there, and how much do we know about the cost and accessibility of childcare? Because, Mr Speaker, we know that in many cases, getting to and from these jobs and the cost of childcare will actually make it worthless to be in those jobs. What's the point of that? What's the point of putting that much pressure and stress upon young families by doing that, by putting those obligations? Yes, let's make sure that where people can work, they will. But let's not put obligations on them that are impossible to deliver on and actually end up putting them into a worse economic situation. Mr Speaker, the Labour Party is opposing this bill. We are opposing this bill because it does nothing to actually create job opportunities. It focuses on the wrong issues. It, in fact, does not support childcare costs, and it does not support the kind of training opportunities that we want New Zealanders to have. Well, the Minister chips in, but once again, we have the issue of the government that cut the training incentive allowance for people to get qualifications that are beyond the basic qualifications, cut that allowance, and therefore said to those people, we don't want you to go on and succeed. We don't want you to actually be part of the workforce in the future. We're going to limit your opportunities. There needs to be a far greater investment in training for people on benefits, There needs to be a far greater investment in training generally, because at the moment we know that over 48% of people on DPB have no formal educational qualifications. Every member of this House knows that if we invest in people, in their training, in their skills, they will make a greater contribution to New Zealand. We know that if we invest in helping to create jobs, we will provide the economic environment in which all New Zealanders will flourish. This piece of legislation is nothing more than a political dog whistle. It is not going to help New Zealanders get into work. It is not going to ensure that the future of New Zealand is offering itself up to be the future of New Zealand, to have the potential realised that they have. Mr Speaker, this bill is not addressing the issues that New Zealanders want addressed. It needs to focus on jobs, it needs to focus on training, it needs to focus on skills, and it needs to support New Zealanders, not blame them.
I call the Honourable Minister